They're going to come more fast and furious now, by the way. I don't know if everyone knows this, but the orders of the Talmud, the tractates within them, are often organized very roughly by length. So the big ones come at the beginning, and then as you get toward the end of the order, you get faster and faster tractates. So we start tomorrow with Beitzah, which is only 39 pages. So we'll all be back here again very soon to celebrate that tractate. And in that vein, I actually wanted to ask you, our participants, our readers, if you had any suggestions for us of things you'd like to see us do differently in a Siyyum. We'd like to try and shake it up a little as the Siyyumim start coming faster and more furious. We did, for Tractate Shekalim, do a quiz show. Some of you joined us for that. That was kind of fun. So if you have any suggestions, please go ahead and pop them in the chat, things you'd like to see us do differently in a Siyyum. And we'd love to take those into consideration as we plan for the coming tractates. But in the meantime, let's focus on Tractate Sukkah. I'm going to ask all of you the same thing that I asked our panelists before they arrived, and that is, what is something of, now that we've done 7 tractates of the Talmud, what is something about this tractate that really stands out to you as different from the other tractates? Did it have a different feel, a different mood, a different focus, a different spiritual energy? Anything that struck you as really unique to Tractate Sukkah? I'd love to hear what you have to say. Anything that interests you to share, please go ahead and put it in the chat. I'm going to try and monitor the chat and share some of the things you say out loud as we continue through this Siyyum. Rabbis Lopatin, Strausberg, and Fruchter, would love to hear your thoughts on that as well. Okay, so I'm gonna stop speaking and give someone else a chance. I'm gonna pass the microphone over to Rabbi Avi Strausberg. She's gonna share a little teaching from this tractate, and then we will continue and cycle through our panelists.
Amazing, great. Thank you, Rachel, so much for that. I'm sharing in the source sheet for those of you that are visual learners and want to see the text that I'm referring to. You can open it up and actually see it, or you can just stay here with me. I want to share one of my favorite sugiyot that we got to really early in Sukkah, if you can remember, which wasn't so far ago. This is the sugya in which the rabbis are trying to figure out, how do we know, from where do we derive the minimum height of a sukkah? Remember, the minimum height of the sukkah is 10 tvachim, which is actually not so tall. 10 tvachim, when you do the math, ends up being, you have to have a sukkah that's at least about 3 feet tall. And the rabbis are discussing, from where do we know that that's the minimum height, that you can't have a sukkah that's less than 3 feet tall? And they say we derive it, this is going back to Daf Daled, Hey, 4 or 5. And they say we derive it from the height of the Aron, from the ark. That just as the ark with its kapor, with its covering, is 10 tvachim, so too that's where we want to derive the minimum height for the sukkah. And in that daf, on that sugya, it says, we quote the pasuk, "No arati lecha sham v'dibarti itcha me'al kaporet." God says, "I will join you there, and I will speak to you from above the covering of the ark." The idea that God, that we are building with the Aron, with the ark, this ark that is 10 tvachim, and that's where God is going to be sort of above in God's domain. We are going to be below, but that height right above the kapor, that's where God is going to join with us, and that's where God is going to talk with us. And so that then when we are recreating our Sukkot with this minimum height of 10 tvachim, so too Rashi says, there's this domain above, everything above 10 tvachim is God's domain, everything below is our domain. And really a sukkah that's built at the minimum height of 10 tvachim, that is the meeting place. That's the joining place where we're getting sort of close to God, not quite, because there's the above and the below. So I want to share a bit of that sugya, just read a little bit inside out. So after the Gemara establishes that there are these 2 separate domains, there's God's domain above 10 tvachim, our domain below, the Gemara then challenges that and says, "Velo yorda shechina lamata," and did Shechina really never get below that height of 10 tvachim? We just said God's above. Did God really never come below the hakativ? But it's written, "Vayeret Hashem al Har Sinai." It says that God came down on Mount Sinai. It sounds very clearly, the pshat, the basic meaning of that text is that God was down below, God was in our domain. And the Gemara responds, "Lamala me'asurat tvachim." No, even when God was down on Har Sinai, it was still above the 10 tfachim. And again, we're going to say, V'hakati v'amdu ragla v'yom hahu al har hazeitim. We're going to say, but actually on this day that God stood with God's legs on, to the extent that God has legs, God stood with God's legs on the Mount of Olives. It seems like God is right there, that God is down with us, crossing this domain. And again, the Gemara asserts, no, it was above 10 tfachim. God was staying in the domain. And again, we say, could it really be that God has this separate domain? God never comes down, that we never go up. The lo alu Moshe ve'Eliyahu l'marom, and did Moshe and Elijah, did Eliyahu never actually go up above 10 tfachim to the heights, to the heavens? V'hakati, but it's written, Moshe Allah el ha'Elohim. It says very clearly, Moshe went up to God. It sounds like Moshe crossed this 10 tfachim boundary, that Moshe went up. And again, the Gemara reasserts, Lamata me'asara, even then, when it says so clearly Moshe went up to God, Moshe was still beneath the 10 tfachim. Moshe was staying in Moshe's domain and God was in God's. And again, but it's written, Vayal Eliyahu b'sara shamayim, that Eliyahu went up in a storm to the heavens. Clearly that must have been above the 10 tfachim. And again, reading against the basic meaning of the verses, the Gemara asserts, no, lamata me'asara, it must have been below the 10 tfachim. So over and over, you have the Gemara reestablishing the idea of these separate domains and saying, no, it couldn't be, there was never any crossing. It goes on a little bit more. The last one that it brings, v'haketi, one more proof, me'achez p'nei kiseh parshez alav anano, quoting from Job. This is a hard pasuk to translate. Me'achez could either mean to cut off, or it could be from like the word la'achos, to grab. In context, it seems like what it means in Job is that God cuts off God's throne and sort of spreads God's cloud out. It's actually a verse that's about God distancing God's self from us, feeling that distance. And instead it's going to be this me'achez, which is about God cutting off, is read in a totally different way by the Gemara. The Gemara says, Ve'amar Rabbi Tanchum says, Melamed shepiras shadai meziv shchinato ve'anano alav, that God spread out God's splendor and spread his cloud upon him, referring to this midrash in Masechet Sanhedrin, where there it's imagined that Moshe was being sort of threatened by the angels up in the heavens, and God says to Moshe, grab a hold of my throne. And so Moshe grabs a hold of the throne, and God spreads out God's ziv, God's splendor upon Moshe, to protecting it. And so this verse here is being meant to read in that midrash of not, as in Job, God cutting everyone off and distancing God's self, but actually a verse of closeness. Moshe grabbing hold of the throne. And so here the verse is saying, didn't Moshe grab a hold of the throne, right? If Moshe grabbed a hold of the throne, he must have been above 10 tfachim. What does the Gemara say? Lemata me'asara. Even then, when Moshe was grabbing hold of the throne, all the time Moshe was underneath this 10 tfachim. And then ultimately what the Gemara wants to say is, how does it work? How could it be that Moshe would grab the throne, would be under 10 tfachim? Ish tarbove, ish tarbavle kisei adasara unakatbe. That the throne sort of descended down. God sort of swung the throne down till right at the height of 10 tfachim, and then Moshe was able to grab a hold of it. So whereas before we wanted to say, the Gemara wanted to say there are these two separate domains. God is above 10 tfachim, we are below. Could it really be that there's no crossing? Ultimately, we allow, there is a moment of just touching. There's a moment of this suspended throne, this close but not quite, of holding onto the throne of this connection that happens at the 10 tfachim, happens at the height of the sukkah. And for me, I just wanted to highlight two things. Why are the rabbis working so hard to read against the pshat, read against the grain of the verses? The grain of the verses that really say, no, God comes down and Moshe comes up. Why is it so important to say there are these two separate domains? I think two things. One is that I think it's teaching us that even in the most intimate of relationships, that boundaries are important. that we have to have some sort of boundaries that we're each setting and that we're honoring and that we're allowing people to set for themselves and that we're respecting for other people, even in intimate relationships. That's the first thing. And I think the second thing is the rabbis are speaking to something that might feel very real for all of us, is a sense of perhaps close but not quite with God, or a sense of touching, of coming into contact and then feeling distance from God. That it's not always, the reality is for many of us, it's not always that we feel as if we're in the same domain as God. It might feel like God is above 10 tefachim and we're below. And so the rabbis are saying, I think that's okay. That's okay. It's okay that you feel like God is in a different domain and you're here. It's okay that sometimes you might feel a little bit of distance, a bit of longing, that longing is part of the relationship. And also you should know that there are going to be moments of closeness. It's at this 10 tefachim that we can almost meet. We can touch for but a moment. We can grab hold of the throne. And that's where we can feel that. So hoping as we finish this Masechta, and also as we're moving into the Chagim, this time of closeness with God and Sukkot, that we should all be so lucky to have that both the intimacy, the sweetness of the longing for God, but also that moment of near touching, of holding onto the throne.
Thank you, Rabbi Strausberg. I also was struck by the intimacy of the relationship between Israel and God, and not just as the people, but each individual's relationship as it was described in this tractate. Speaking of surprising intimacy, I just want to let you guys know where some of you are from today, and just a sense of the flavor of this group. We have now about 250 participants in the chat, and some of you have told us where you're from. Somebody here is from Gdansk, Poland. We've got someone coming in from Santa Cruz, from Denver, from New Mexico, from London, from Fayetteville, North Carolina, from Calabasas, California, from Budapest, from Montreal, Reno, Burnsville, North Carolina, Winnipeg, Cambridge, the UK edition. If you're Cambridge, the Massachusetts edition, let us know. Vegas, Vancouver, Montevideo, Uruguay, Spirit Lake, Iowa, Zurich, and Haifa. So really quite an international, exciting group here. Now I see other people are popping into the chat. Vancouver, Ashland, Oregon, 5 towns, Massachusetts, yep, Cleveland. Keep them coming. That's fun to see, guys. You also all pointed to really interesting things that you saw in the tractate and had some questions for our participants. So before I pass the microphone on to Rabbanit Fruchter to teach us a little bit from this tractate, I'm going to dwell on those for a few minutes. A number of you commented that you were surprised, some of you pleased, that there was less focus on the temple in this tractate. I think some people are sort of overwhelmed by the focus on the temple in Tractates Pesachim and Yoma, but this one really started at home. How do you build your sukkah? How do you dwell in your sukkah? What are the 4 species? How do you use them? Etc. Though we got this question that I thought was interesting. And now I've lost it. Okay, I don't remember who asked it, but somebody asked, did they put a sukkah in the temple and where was it? Does anyone on our panel have an answer to that question? Oh, you guys stumped the panelists. I don't have an answer either. I'm not sure.
No.
Did they build a sukkah in the temple or was this only at home?
I don't have an answer, of course, but that's never stopped a rabbi from speaking. And so I would say that this question leads to another question of that. As far as I know, synagogues, don't have the minhag of davening in the sukkah. People go to shake lulav and etrog sometimes before or right before Hallel. They go into the sukkah. But it's interesting that there didn't develop the minhag, the custom of praying in the sukkah on Sukkot. And that really might be tied into this, that maybe there was not a sukkah in the mikdash or, in the courtyard. Though I guess if the Kohanim had to eat bread, and the end of the Masechet talks about the showbreads, then they had to have a sukkah. But it is interesting that if our synagogues are a mikdash ma'at, represent a small version of the temple, it's interesting that the tefillah is in the synagogue and not in the sukkah.
Yeah, certainly they did surround the altar with willow branches. We talked about that. And that meant both, they decided that meant both standing them up around the altar and parading them around the altar. They brought their lulav and etrog to the temple. They slaughtered about 1 million animals over the course of the week in the temple. So there was definitely a lot of, and of course there was the water drawing ceremony, and there was the blowout party that we had described in the last chapter in the temple, where they have these huge candelabra that are so tall and have so much oil and are so bright that they light up the entire city of Jerusalem, right? And they're jugglers and singers, and, you know, it sounded like it was a real, and anyone who had not seen that party had never seen a real party, right? That's what the Talmud told us. That's more or less a direct quote. So yeah, but I don't think that we got a description of a sukkah in the temple, which doesn't mean there wasn't one. But they were described as being at home. A lot of times we're supposed to imagine the sukkah was on top of the dwelling. A lot of them, people put them on their flat roofs. There were a lot of flat roofs in the ancient world. And some people, as we read in this tractate, would really just rip the plaster off their roof and put schach on top and turn their house into a sukkah, and then replaster at the end of the holiday, right? So yeah, thank you to whoever asked that question. I have more comments of yours that I want to share, but I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to hold them for a few minutes, and first we're going to learn a little bit with Rabbanit Fruchter, and then we will get to those.
Amazing, thanks, Rachel. And just as a response to that question as well, we learned just a week ago or so that people who were on pilgrimage to Jerusalem would be in sukkahs, right? And that's where they would sleep, because as we learned early on in our studies, the sukkah is like our house, right? That's what we do, but we actually don't necessarily pray in our house. We pray in the synagogue or the mikdash, and it's just an interesting sociological phenomenon that now in the 21st century, our shuls sometimes provide for us what we're not yet doing at home. So maybe like we go out and see our shul sukkahs and we're like, oh wait, that's supposed to be in my backyard also, right? And I saw someone say in the chat, this year I was inspired to build my own. Well, that's great, because it's teishvu kein kadur, right? You're supposed to be in the sukkah like you live. And maybe davening doesn't necessarily happen there as well. It's an interesting question. So I loved this masechta. This tractate was so much fun to learn through. And Rachel, one of the questions you highlighted was a perfect entryway into what I've been thinking nonstop about ever since we started, which was the temple. I've been thinking all about the temple, the semi-inaccess that we had to some of the rituals of Masechet Yoma, of Tractate Yoma, versus what's going on here in Tractate Sukkah. And every once in a while, you know, we're at 56 pages, every once in a while, we would come across something and we would shake in our boots and be like, wait a minute, the sukkah's like the ark, like what Rabbi Avi just said? Or just a couple weeks ago, we would be like, wait, whoa. We wave the lulav and esrog like a korban? You know, there would just be these like things that would pop up where suddenly, instead of imagining our 4 species in our hands, we imagine like an animal that we're waving around in the air. And we even talk about in this tractate specific blemishes that our 4 species cannot have, kind of like they're animals that are waiting to be offered on the altar. So in some ways, it has nothing to do with the temple, and in other ways, it has everything to do with the temple, because this tractate is all about taking the temple and putting it, or versions of it, in our backyards and in our hands to empower us year after year. And going back to what Rav Avi just shared, there's this aspect of closeness, right? Just being able to reach God in ways that perhaps feel inaccessible when we don't have the temple. And I wanted to point out a teaching just on yesterday's daf. I actually found myself getting a little bit verklempt, choked up, when learning this particular piece of Talmud. It was, speaking of, Rachel said we offered just about 1 million animals, right, over the holiday of Sukkot. And we had said, well, actually, we've got 70 bulls, right? And it goes down progressively until you get to the single bull of Shmini Atzeret. And okay, very interesting. Like sometimes we're in Masechet Yoma or Tractate Yoma, we're talking about some permutation of sacrifices and we're talking about numbers, fine. But then our Gemara goes in a very different direction. It gives us a parable of a king who says, give me a huge party, huge, big party with all the nations of the world. Invite everybody, all the bulls, right? All of the animals, invite everybody. And then after the whole party is over, it's just beautiful. It says, Amar le'ohavo, the king says to the king's loved ones, Aseh li su'uda ketana kedei she'ehana mimcha. Make me a small little meal, just me and you, so we can hang out together. And I found like I got a chill down my spine, this image of imagining kind of like the climax or the end of Sukkot being God really just sitting us down and saying to us, it's just us, right? It's like all of this stuff, all of these rituals, all of these different pieces, they're important, but you should know you can hold them in your hand. You can sit in them in your house. You can set your table and find me. And at the end of all of this, it's just going to be you and me at the table. And I'm leaving Masechet Sukkah with a tremendous amount of inspiration. I think, we could have said, oh, we wish we had started this at Sukkah so we could whatever. But actually, it was perfect timing, right? Because we finished it with this experience of closeness as we enter some of the rituals of the high holidays. I thought this was a really powerful idea and something to just chew on is, can you think of even other times in Tractate Sukkah where it seems to be like there was a temple ritual that we were trying to grab for in some of these rituals of Sukkot. So I'll stop here, pass it back to you, Rachel.
Okay, thank you. Rabbanit Fruchter, you're right. We had this lineup between Tractate Pesachim, and then it ended, and then we had Pesach. And this one is like a little early, and we're going to have the holidays, and then we're going to do Tractate Rosh Hashanah after the holidays are over, because in the interim, we have Tractate Beit Sah. So we'll see how that feels to celebrate the holiday and then have the tractate about it. But yes, this not only does this set us up for Sukkot in a couple of weeks, but the way it falls out with the calendar on this cycle, it also brings us into this vision of intimacy with God that does in a certain way lead us beautifully into the high holidays. I'm scrolling through some of your comments about what you loved about this tractate. And one of you commented that you were starting to feel some repetition. You were seeing things that you recognized from Shabbat and Eruvin, and that's true. We will see that more and more. The more Talmud we study, we'll see they didn't have like great indexing or hyperlinking, so they often would repeat material, either ideas or whole blocks of material wholesale. So there might come a point where you're reading something, you think, gee, I think I read this already, and that might actually be true. That happens in the Talmud. But it's nice to also, I think, feel like, oh, we're starting to get familiar with some tropes. Not everything is so new and strange. Somebody whose screen name is JDC Hungry, I'm sorry, I don't know your name, tells us that this is your favorite Masechet so far. You want to come on and tell us why? I'm cold calling the participants this time. You want to unmute yourself and tell us? I'm going to see if this works. Can we find this person in the crowd?
I'm not sure if they can unmute themselves. Who are we looking for?
JDC Hungry.
We need.
Are you all are forcibly?
Oh, is that Rabbi Paley? That's exciting. Moving from New York to Hungary.
All right. I had another person I wanted to ask. Jane Kaplan, are you here? Ben, can you unmute her?
I'm looking for her.
Yeah. This is an experiment. We haven't tried cold calling you guys before.
It's possible that they could raise their hands, and that would make them easier to find.
I was struck by Jane's comment too. That's why I'm looking for her, because she felt that there was a lot more ethics in this tractate,
Cool.
and I was wondering if
Rabbi Paley just unmuted.
I felt it was I love this. It's my favorite Masechet so far. I love the emotion parts of it. I love figuring out everything from the shofar and the throwing of the etrogim at whoever it was that they threw it at. Maybe it was even Alexander Yanai. But I felt that it was much more engaged with just as the wonderful Rabbi Avi Strausberg said, with reaching towards God and receiving God. That was really a fantastic celebration of it. And with it's a bit of dour parts of Yoma, I felt the celebration, Yom Simchatenu, of Tractate Sukkah. It was by far, I really loved almost every sentence.
Amazing. Thank you for being willing to be cold called in the middle of our Siyyum.
Thank you for unmuting me. It's very late here, so I'm appreciative.
Okay. Did we find Jane Kaplan?
We did not.
Okay. All right. Okay, so let's then go to Rabbi Lopatin, who's going to work through the last few lines of this tractate with us. And Rabbi Lopatin, we got a question, which maybe you can answer, maybe not, which is why was this story about the watch of Bilgar placed at the very end of the tractate? The commenter said that the tractate ended on a positive note, but because of this story, it almost didn't, which was kind of a downer after all the excitement of the Sukkot party and the beauty of the spiritual connection to God. Why did we end here? Why don't you go ahead and end us and see if you can answer that question for us.
Hey, good. Great question. I think it's sort of, I want to approach it by what the comments that a lot of people made about how practical Masechet Sukkah is, and that it really, and it's actually practical in a doable way, because Eruvin is very practical. People do put up Eruvs, but it's not always in such a easy way to understand. And certainly Sukkah is not that easy, but it's this really, we feel it's really relevant. Now, I think this story, I'm not as interested, honestly, in the different mishmarot of the Kohanim, about the Kohanim. They had their weeks, and they ate from the showbreads, and they ate from the sacrifice, and all that stuff. I don't know if the Talmud, I don't want to say that, they're living, a lot of them are in time way post temple. And so, I think that the story of Miriam Bat Bilga is really, I'm excited that at least we're ending with a punchy story. And it might not be so exciting, but it is very relevant. And frankly, I think it challenges the temple. Many people mentioned, and we've, Rachel, you mentioned it also, that the temple is not as prominent in this Masechet as you might think, because Sukkot is the ultimate temple holiday. It's not always clear that the rabbis of the Talmud, Mishnah and Gemara, were so pro-temple, that this was, and we always talk about Ibana Beit HaMikdash, rebuild the temple, all that, but it's not always so clear that was the way they were. And Miriam Bat Bilga, Miriam was the daughter of Bilga, that this division, one of the 24 divisions of the Kohanim, is named after. She's a little bit of a heroine. And now, again, I don't want to be, anachronistic and interpreting in a way that the rabbis of the Talmud would interpret. Let's see a little bit. So Bilga, that mishmar, that division of the Kohanim, was penalized, as the Mishnah says on Nun Vav Amud Aleph. And they had to eat their showbread in the south. The north was a holier area. So a lot of the holy sacrifices are slaughtered in the north, and they had to get it in the south. They didn't get their little locker. Everyone got a little window, a chalona locker, and also called Beit HaChalifot. And they didn't get their locker, so they had no places to hide their knife. And they also, I hate this image, and it's touched, the Sukkah, Masechet touches on it earlier, of Isru Chag, of sort of tie up those bulls, and then they had these, collars for the bulls, Tabata Kvu'ah. They had these movable collars for the bulls that you restrain them in. I love steak. I'm not a vegetarian, but still, I just don't like this kind of image so much of tying up the bulls and restraining them. So in any case, Bilga's, that division was penalized that it didn't have a movable collar. And so all these penalties, one. So we read on the very last Amud, there's a story about Bilga. She gave up Himira Data vehalcha v'niseit l'sarjot. She married a soldier of the Greeks, an ultimate Gentile, right? Not Jewish, not a philosopher, not, a soldier in the Greek army. So it's interesting, again, we think about this holiday of Sukkot, which is this holiday, the international holiday, as Rabbanit Dasi mentioned. Yes, dogs. Is that dog restrained with a collar or something? Free the dog. If you can't free the dog, mute the dog. She really rebelled. First of all, whenever there's a woman mentioned in the Talmud, it's like, hooray, 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 thanks, Rabbi Paley. I think that, and I'm willing to say, I don't care, I'm willing to interpret it in a positive way. So again, that touches on that wonderful question. I understand there's a lot of misogyny in the Talmud, meaning some of the rabbis were, whatever, misogynists, whatever you want to say, or had issues. But what I would say is that whenever there's a woman, she's a hero. So this woman married on this, we're thinking about, well, isn't Sukkot international holiday? And she did the international thing. She married a Greek soldier. Okay, we could talk about intermarriage and all that later. And certainly the Talmud is not excited about that. But she came into the Heichal, oh my goodness, with these are the Syrian Greeks. This is the Hanukkah story. That period where the Greeks were in charge before the Maccabees took over, before Matityahu, son of Yochanan, took over, which, by the way, if you really study Gemara and the history, the rabbis were not so excited about the Maccabees and the Hashmonaim. So she came in, and then she makes a fascinating point. She says, locus, locus, you altar, you're a wolf. You're a wolf. Ad mataya tamechaleh mamonam shel Yisrael. How long are you going to take up the Jewish money? The iyata omed aleim b'shad hadchak, and you're not helping the Jews out on this terrible times when they need you. That's really interesting. This is a big question. I know in Orthodox circles and observance, the high cost of being Jewish, the cost of Jewish education, the cost of buying a lulav and etrog. They're not so cheap anymore. I think they used to be like $20. Now they're like, I don't know, 60, 50. So it's a really interesting thing and an interesting challenge for the altar, for the temple. Clearly, she was penalized by it. Remember, also the temple was run by, these are the Hashmonaim that we don't necessarily love anyway. They really penalized her. So again, I don't want to be anachronistic, and clearly, chas v'shalom, she's challenging the rituals of the mikdash and all that, of the temple. But when we think about her question now, and when we talk again of Tractate Sukkah in the context of the rabbis trying to make it relevant, which I think is a very honest read of Tractate Sukkah. And again, all the rituals that we still do to try to make that the rituals of the temple 2,000 years ago relevant today, marching around with the lulav and etrog, or Hoshana Rabbah with the aravot, so with the willows. So I think it behooves us to think about her question, and always to think about is, Judaism costs a lot. We learn Torah, it takes a lot of our time. What is it producing? Is it, what are the rabbis that are learning all this Torah? Are they bringing ethics into our world? Are they bringing menschlichkeit into this world? I think it's a really interesting challenge. Well, okay, so the rabbis didn't like it. When the rabbis heard it, they sealed They fixed the collar that grabbed the animals, wasn't effective anymore. Satmu echalona, they closed the locker, the room, and the yesho. Okay, and they we know about the south thing also. They own that. Then some people said, now this is a totally different read. Yesh omri nishmarto shohel lavo. Nothing to do with Miriam bat Bilga. So no heroine. They were lazy. They didn't like the temple, so they came late. So this is an interesting story. This is, I think, a real contrast. Miriam bat Bilga had a principled argument against the temple. She probably had a principled argument against Judaism itself. She converted. We cannot like her, we can have problems with her, but it was a principled approach. But the other story is that they just came late, and therefore Yeshev of Achiv Imo v'Shimesh Tachtav. So then the other Mishmar had to do double duty, and really had to. The other division of Kohanim that thought they were going to get their day off, they had to stay. It's really what's going on a lot of times in hospitals, that people have to do extra sittings, extra shifts. Now, this was a bonus for them because they got more stuff, as the Talmud says. But in any case, this is an example. I think one example is if you have a challenge against so much that's in Judaism, make it a sincere and powerful challenge. Don't make it a lazy challenge. Don't make it sort of not showing up or just giving up. I didn't like this. I didn't like services. I didn't like this, and I'm giving up. No, challenge. It goes for Israel as well. Challenge. Be involved. Be connected. So then it goes off into this area. I'm just going to read it so we can finish this Masechet. Even though neighbors of Rishayim are normally not rewarded, Shchine Bilga Nistakru, but the neighbors of Bilga, meaning this other division that had to do their shift, they were rewarded. So Yeshevav, who did this extra shift, got to get their bread, their showbread from the north. So we said we can penalize everybody because that whole mishmar, that whole division didn't come. But but what about Miriam bat Bilga? Why are we penalizing the whole tribe, the whole division, if it's just Miriam bat Bilga who's making the trouble? So we say, you know what? She got it from someone. She probably got it from her dad, Bilga. Bilga gave her that rebellious instinct. Again, the rabbis penalized her, but good for her, right? A little bit of rebellion, it's good. So, what about Shuma? So just because Bilga, her dad, gave her this rebellious instinct, we're going to penalize the whole group? So we say, but he says, Oy la Rasha, Oy la Shcheno. Classic statement. Abaye says, and it's good that Abaye is saying it. Who else would say something like this? So anyone surrounding a bad person gets a bad reputation. Shchenim, tov latzadik, tov l'shcheno. But it ends, as the questioner said, it almost ended on a negative note. It ends on a positive note about if you're next to someone good, then you positively gain. Shneamar imru tzadik ki tov ki fri malem yochelu. Say about a tzaddik that they're a righteous person, they're good because they eat from the fruit of the tzaddik. Now, before we just leave this, I think that maybe Sukkot is about neighborliness. And as was mentioned before, that the Shechina, Rav Avi developed this whole thing connecting with the Shechina, Shachein, meaning a neighbor, Shechina, meaning God's presence. The Sukkah, the whole idea is that we should hang out with a great neighbor. Who is the great neighbor? Maybe HaKadosh Baruch Hu, maybe God. Who is the great neighbor? Maybe it's all the people that we're connecting with, that we invite into our sukkah or we eat in the sukkah. So, and maybe a great neighbor is someone rebellious. Now, again, that's not so consistent because they say, oi l'rasha, oi l'shchino, it's not good, not good. But Belsai Square Synagogue doesn't seem to agree. But I think that definitely let's make Sukkot, let's work out these contradictions of being a universal holiday. The Jewish people is responsible to be a light unto the nations, and yet these national goals, and we have our own people to look after. So all the questions that Miriam Bat Bilga had, those are good questions, but maybe the tractate ends like, let's do it in a positive way, in a way of shchenim, of coming together in the best way, rather than separating and leaving our people. So hopefully that will be a message of Sukkot.
Thank you, Rabbi Lopatin. I have a couple of little kids who are in the superhero phase of things, and it's always good to be reminded that there's usually not pure good guys and pure bad guys, as there usually are in some of these superhero stories they're into, including in the Talmud. I want to thank Peretz Wolf Prusen, thank you, who privately chatted me with the answer to the question we started with at the beginning here about whether there was a sukkah in the temple. So this answer, he tells me, comes from Lawrence Schiffman, who is one of the preeminent scholars of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And what Professor Schiffman points us to is Nehemiah 8:16. This is at the very end of the Hebrew Bible. Nehemiah 8:16 reads, "So the people went out and brought them and made themselves booths or sukkot on their roofs, in their courtyards, and in the courtyard of the house of God." Okay, there it is, in the square of the water gate and in the square of the Ephraim gate. So the Bible does say that there was a sukkah in the temple. And then also in the temple scroll, which is one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, so what are the Dead Sea Scrolls? The Dead Sea Scrolls are a whole bunch of Jewish sectarian writings from the first few centuries before the Common Era. I'm not sure if I have the dates quite right, but like the first 2 centuries before the Common Era. I think some of them might even be up to the 1st century. So they're earlier than rabbinic writings, and they are sectarian. They're probably the work of a group of Jews called the Essenes, who are not the Jewish group that eventually became the rabbis. They're a different Jewish group. But in any case, they provide a ton of evidence for Judaism in the ancient world because they were really marvelously preserved in some caves where they were hidden during the war with the Romans. So the temple scroll also talks about the sukkah being constructed in the temple. So that's another source that tells us that there probably was a sukkah in the courtyard of the temple. And the temple scroll goes even further. It kind of suggests, if I'm catching this, because I'm kind of reading this while doing the Siyyum, so Peretz, if you're here and I'm getting this wrong, jump in and tell us. Ben, see if you can unmute him so he can do that. The temple scroll seems to suggest that the sukkah in the temple courtyard was for the priests and the Levites and so forth, and that they could actually then perform the mitzvah on behalf of the rest of Israel, almost sort of so they didn't, maybe suggesting so they kind of didn't have to. Obviously, that's not the path the rabbis took, but that seems to be suggested by the temple scroll. But there you have it, 2 ancient sources, the Bible itself in Nehemiah, and also the temple scroll suggesting that, yes, there was a sukkah in the temple courtyard, which makes sense for the priests and Levites at the very least. So thank you, Peretz, for doing the legwork for us on that one. All right, we're gonna conclude the tractate now with the Hadran and the Kaddish. So Dasi, are you starting us with the Hadran and then you'll kick it? No, I knew I was gonna get it wrong. Rabbi Strausberg, you're going to start us with the Hadran, and you're going to and Rabbi Fruchter is going to finish it, and then Rabbi Lopatin, you're going to say the Kaddish with us. And then if for folks who are still here, I will say 3 words about Beit Zah, which will start tomorrow.
Hadran alach Masechet Sukkah, V'Adra Chalan, V'Atan alach Masechet Sukkah, V'Data Chalan, Lad Ninashe Minach Masechet Sukkah, V'Lad Tinashe Minan. La ba'alma hadin v'la ba'alma da'ateh. Yehi ratzon milfanecha Adonai Eloheinu v'Elohei avotenu. Shetehei Toratcha umanutenu ba'olam hazeh utehei imanu le'olam haba. Chanina bar Papa, Rami bar Papa, Nachman bar Papa, Achai bar Papa, Abba bar Papa, Rafram bar Papa, Rachish bar Papa, Sorcha bar Papa, Ada bar Papa, Daru bar Papa. Arev na Adonai Eloheinu et divrei Toratcha befinu v'fiyot amcha Beit Yisrael. V'niyeh kulanu anachnu b'tzetzaenu v'tzetzei amcha Beit Yisrael kulanu yudei shmecha v'lomdei Toratcha. Vai techakmenu mitzvotecha ki leolam hili v'hi libi tamim bechukecha lema'an lo ebosh leolam lo eshkach pikudecha ki bam chiyitani baruch ata Adonai lamdeni chukecha amen 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 sela ba'ed.
Modim anachnu lefanecha, Adonai Eloheinu v'Elohei avotenu, shesamta chalkenu miyoshvei beit hamidrash, v'lo samta chalkenu miyoshvei karnot, she'anu mashkimim v'hem mashkimim. Anu mashkimim l'divrei Torah, v'hem mashkimim l'dvarim b'telim. Anu amelim, v'hem amelim. Anu amelim u'mekablim schar, v'hem amelim v'einam mekablim schar. Anu ratzim, v'hem ratzim. Anu ratzim l'chayei olam haba, v'hem ratzim l'ver shachat. Shne'amar, v'ata Elohim toridim l'ver shachat, anshe damim u'mirma, lo yechasu yemehem, v'ani avtach bach. Yehi ratzon lefanecha Adonai Elohai. Kishem she'azartani l'sayim masechet Sukkah, kain ta'azreni latfil masechtot u'sfarim achirim l'saymam, lilmod u'lelamed, lishmor v'lasod l'kayim, et kol divrei Talmud Toratacha bi'ahava, u'zchut kol hatanaim v'amoraim, v'talmidei chachamim, ya'amod li u'lezari, shelo tamush haTorah mipi zari v'zera zari ad olam, v'titkayim bi, v'hitalechecha tancha otach, V'shachpacha tishmor alecha v'hakitzot hahi tesichacha ki vi yirbu yamecha v'yosifu lecha shnot chayim orach yamim b'yamina v'smola osher v'chavod Adonai oz le'amo yitain Adonai yivarech et amo b'shalom.
Okay, and by the way, so many opinions say a man or a woman, anyone can say this Kaddish, not just for men. I'm going to stand, and if this is the tractate of coming together of Shchenim with God and with everyone here, so I feel the presence of everyone here for the special Kaddish only said at a Siyyum and at a funeral. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah be'alamadu atid li'charata u'lachaya metai u'la'aska l'chaya alma u'lemivnei kardu shalem l'shachal hechalei begavei Ulme'aker pulchan anuchra me'ar ulatava pulchan adishmayel atre yamlichu chabrichu b'malchutei v'karei b'chayechon u'v'yemechon u'v'chaydecho beit Yisrael v'agalav izman kariv v'imru amen. Yehei shemei Rabbah mevarach v'lamo me'al maya yibarach v'ishtabach v'par v'tramam v'tnasei v'nadar v'dalev v'dalav shmei v'shabarichu le'elam v'kovachad havishirata tushvachata v'nechamata damiram be'alma v'imru amen. Al Yisrael v'Rabbanan v'al tamidei hon v'al kol tamidei hon v'al kol man daskim b'araita. That's you. V'al kol man daskim b'araita divatra hadein v'divachol atar v'atar yehei lahon u'lachon shlama rabba. China v'chisa v'rachamei v'chayei arichei v'zonei revichei for kanamin kodama v'un v'ishmai avar avim rambein yehei shalom marabam ishmai v'chayim tovim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'im rambein o se shalom b'mamav v'yaseh b'rachamav shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen.
Yesher koach, everyone. Thank you for joining us. If you have 2 minutes, I will give you a little preview of Tractate Beit Sah, and then I will wish everyone Shana Tova. So, Tractate Beit Sah. If you know the Hebrew word Beit Sah, you know it means egg, and you probably know it from the context of the Seder plate, right? This has nothing to do with that. In fact, it doesn't even have all that much to do with eggs. Beitzah is just the first word of the tractate. The other name for this tractate is Tractate Yom Tov. It's all about festivals. So on the Hebrew calendar, we know that Shabbat is a sacred day, but also festivals are sacred days. We're talking about the first and last days of Passover. We're talking about Shavuot. We're talking about the first and last days of Sukkot, Rosh Hashanah. These days are sacred festival days, and they have a lot of the same rules that Shabbat does, but not exactly the same. And that's what we're going to be talking about for the next 39 pages. So as Shabbat has a work prohibition, festivals also have a work prohibition, though it is phrased a little bit differently in the Torah. The Torah says you should do no melacha on Shabbat. It says about festivals, you should do no melechet avodah. What is the exact difference? I'm not 100% sure, but I'm going to figure it out by tomorrow to tell you guys. And also, the punishment for violating Shabbat into the Torah is extremely severe. It's death. But that's not true of festivals. There's no punishment indicated, and the rabbis understand it to be lashes. So there's a little less severity that comes in with violating the laws of festivals. And finally, the Torah also says that there's an exemption to the work prohibition on festivals. You're allowed to prepare food. So all of this is teased out by the rabbis in this tractate. How do the work prohibitions on festivals compare to the work prohibitions on Shabbat, particularly given that the Torah does make very clear that festivals are meant to be times of joy, and we do not want the joy to be lost in all this discussion of labor you can and cannot do. So I'm looking forward to studying that with you guys starting tomorrow. And I wish everybody a Shana Tova, Mituka. Thank you all for joining us. It was great to see you.